The smoke of a cigar burned the edge of his knuckles, and Patton laughed like a thunderclap, because the map beneath his palm floored him into being. The jagged coastline, the tiny inked adels, the black arrows he'd drawn with a red pencil that did not know how to quit. "They want precision," he said, voice raw with hunger. "But what they need is momentum. Let me lead the invasion, and I'll end this war in 3 weeks. I'll take Tokyo by Christmas if they let me." His eyes, green, incredulous, full of the single currency he trusted most, locked on William Halsey, as if daring the admiral to refuse him, to say no to the hunger in his jaw. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Halsey watched the cigar smoke curl like a question mark and felt, bizarrely, like a man who had just been offered to dance on a minefield. He inhaled, long and slow, and the room grew quiet around him. The humming generators, the distant hammer of waves against the dock, the soft rustle of uniform fabric. Everything folded into a particular, precise ache. When the admiral spoke, it was measured, a ledger kept with careful hands. "General," he said, "you do not possess the fleet, you do not possess the sea. You possess tanks and a genius for breaking things open. The ocean is another language." Patton snorted, the sound like gravel. "Sea language or not, Admiral, the way to finish this is to move fast. You've been shadowing 24 strikes and losing men to storms and delay. Men drown from indecision." He tapped the map as if the paper could be made to understand what bones already did. Motion, velocity, the kind of cruelty that passes as efficiency. "Send me the transports. Put me in charge. I'll give you victory and the kind of closure that leaves men proud." Closure. Halsey's chest tightened at the word. He had seen closure as blow by blow, bodies by names, counted aloud in officers' quarters while the ocean kept silent. He had learned to carry the ledger of loss like a ledger of oil-stained pages, the ink smudged by salt and grief. To say yes to Patton would be to sign a contract on impulse, to press a hand to a wound that might bleed nations dry. He could feel the ghost of sailors beneath his boots, the voices of men who had trusted him in storms and found the sea indifferent. "You end things fast," Halsey said, voice made of ship-hull timber, "and the sea remembers." The war room smelled of coffee and must, the fluorescent light harsh against metals and tired faces. Officers shifted in their chairs, numerals and ranks coiled into careful restraint. Patton's presence was an inciting current in the room. He moved like a man who had been carved from live wood, every angle a decision. Halsey watched him instead of speaking, cataloging the scar that Patton's jaw, the pump of his throat when he spoke of strategy, the way his hands made confession certificates out of generals' plans. It was not just arrogance that radiated from him. It was a desperate faith, the kind men cling to when everything else is uncertain. It was also, Halsey suspected with a private, sinking knowledge, the voice of a man who measured himself by conquest because fear lived underneath. Between them and the map sat Mara Iwasaki, a slim figure in a gray intelligence uniform whose presence was a kind of taut wire. She traced a route with 2 fingertips, as if feeling for a seam in the paper, not wanting to break the fragile possibility she alone held. Born in Honolulu to Japanese parents, Mara wore her divided loyalties like a private scar. Her dark hair was cropped at the neck, her eyes were the cool, dispassionate color of code. Yet when she looked at Halsey, something like relief softened her face, the astral recognition of a man who also kept storms on a ledger. To Patton, she offered a wary compass. To Halsey, she offered a quiet confidence that unsettled him more deeply than any battle report. "You speak as though men are chess pieces," Patton went on, leaning his weight onto the table so his voice could roll across the map like a tide. Admiral, you plan, and the enemy shifts while you write your notes. Give me command of the landings, and the momentum will be ours. The Navy will supply, and I will take the beaches." Mara's fingers paused. She had intercepted a sequence of messages in the past week. Buried transmissions, half-phrases, syllables of surrender, if only handled with the precise patience of translation. The code meant possibilities. A rumored fanaticism retreating before pragmatic counsels. A potential opening that could be coaxed into a surrender if the Allied approach insisted on signaling a willingness to negotiate. Her intelligence resided as a small explosive thing in her chest, something she could release with words or bury like a live grenade. She did not yet trust either man to wield it. Halsey's hesitation was not a moral spectacle he wore publicly. It was an internal ledger, each life a line item balanced against the cost of orders. He could picture the faces of his sailors as if they were lit by lanterns in a church, the quiet ones, the blasphemers, the jokers, and feel guilt coiling in slow knots when he thought of sending more into the maw of an operation he feared would be catastrophic. Patton's raw demand cracked open something in him more complicated than authority. A recognition that this was not merely a strategic argument, it was an invitation to resolve a private reckoning with himself. If he agreed, would he absolve his own haunted indecision with the blunt instrument of haste? If he refused, how many more names would be written into the ocean's ledger? "You hesitate, Admiral," Patton said, and his eyes softened for a fraction, a soldier's pity. "You fear the wrong kind of closure." Halsey wanted to ask which closure was the right kind. He wanted to strip Patton bare of that roar and see the man underneath, the trembling, private thing that perhaps mapped his worth to triumph. Instead, he kept his mouth sealed because war had taught men to hide more than they revealed, and the most dangerous things often lived in the quietest corners. "Orders come from the top," Halsey said finally, and the phrase landed like a ship's anchor. "MacArthur and Nimitz coordinate, and there is a chain. I will not be bullied into a hasty decision." He could hear the dry sorrow threading through his own voice. He'd made decisions before that were fast, that had tasted of victory and of ash. He had also made choices that had cost lives because he believed he was protecting more in return. He had been, more than once, the man who sat in the calm after a storm and counted losses. The ledger never made sense. Patton laughed, abruptly and without warmth. "Then you fear being decisive, Admiral. You fear responsibility. Give me the transport coordinates and I'll show you what decisive looks like." Mara's hand moved again, this time with resolve. "General," she said, the sound of her voice brittle with the enormous weight of a revelation she hadn't yet committed to words. "There are signals intercepted this week that suggest negotiations at high levels. Not surrender in the immediate total sense, but channels, diplomatic veins that could be stimulated without an all-out invasion. There's a chance for a transfer of power that avoids wholesale casualties." She had rehearsed that sentence in her head until it felt like armor. Speaking it in the room made her wrists tremble. Patton's mouth hardened. "Negotiations? Or tricks? You think they're going to hand us Tokyo in return for civilities? I don't believe in riddles when men are dying." He slammed a fist to the table so the map shivered. The officers nearest jumped as if a storm had turned its face. Halsey watched Mara's eyes, reading more than she let speak. Admiration threaded her caution. Fear tended her instincts. She admired Halsey not because he was untouchable, but because he, unlike Patton, held his responsibility like a rare thing, not to be squandered. Halsey's restraint had saved men before. It had also allowed indecision to linger until opportunities closed. "You have evidence?" Halsey asked. His voice was the sea and thunder, steady enough to carry command, soft enough to admit doubt. Mara nodded once, the movement decisive. "Fragments," she said. "Encrypted suggestions of willingness to speak if approached through intermediaries." Names, men who hold sway, and actions that hint at exhaustion rather than fanaticism. But the way you approach this will decide what becomes visible. A battalion on a beach could seal off a communication channel permanently. Patton's jaw clenched. "So you say sacrifice is negotiable," he said, and in the contour of that phrase was the hidden math of his life. Men were units to be spent to buy swift ends. "You ask me to trust whispers while I am supposed to order men forward." "You ask me to gamble with lives on a philosophy," Halsey countered. And when his voice cracked, just a fraction, a strange light shone in Patton's eyes. Not pity, not exactly anger. Something more like offended tenderness, as if Halsey had criticized a part of Patton's identity. They bore at each other across the table like two weathered hulls, both seaworthy and both ready to dash against the same cliff. The war room felt suddenly narrow, as though the world had folded to the size of the map and the breadth of these three. Outside, a cargo plane cut across the sky in a distant, lonely arc. Halsey thought of storms, a sailor's superstition that a man could sense one before it arrived, and felt the weight of impending violence pressing a bronze hand to his sternum. He did not trust Patton's insistence. He did not trust the seduction of decisive cruelty. He also did not trust a passive acceptance of diplomacy when it might be a mirage. Between the two of them stood Mara, who had the power to tilt destiny with a handful of coded pages. The dilemma she introduced was a cleaver poised over the map of thousands of lives. Halsey felt an unfamiliar tremor, less of fear than of a deep, reluctant curiosity. Patton had the kind of force that had always made him dangerous to himself, but also strangely necessary in the world's broken calculus. He had, beneath his swagger, the essence of a man who could make the world obey blunt order. Halsey had the essence of a man who could shepherd lives through storms with patience that sometimes bled into procrastination. Between them, something was being negotiated silently. Reckoning, love, the possibility that two dangerous men might find in each other an answer neither wanted to admit. They left the map unfolded like a wound. The war room emptied into the humid dusk of the Pacific base, men dissolving into the lit corridors like fish into shoals. Mara lingered, fingers still against the paper, eyes fixed on an invisible horizon, as if she could read the future like a tide chart. Patton walked out, shoulders thrown back, the cigar a beacon in the dim, a man gone to his own private war. Halsey remained, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the ocean as if it might finally give an answer. Outside, a gull cried, and Halsey imagined two men on a beach decades from now, older and softened, arguing about the same map, about the same moment they'd been tempted to end or to save the world. The ledger in his mind fluttered with doubt and obligation. The choice was not merely strategic. It was moral. It was intimate. He understood, with a sudden shameful intimacy, that refusing Patton would be to refuse the possibility of being forgiven by decisive action. Accepting him might condemn thousands. The dilemma closed in like the tide. He swallowed and picked up a pencil, fingers steady as a captain's. He began to make the notes that would define not only a campaign, but the shape of what he might become in the hollow Patton's arrival had carved into him. Halsey did not go to bed that night. He sat at his desk with the pencil he'd used on the map and the ledger of names he had not allowed himself to touch in months. The ocean's night whispering against the hull beyond the porthole. Outside, searchlights scoured the low clouds, and the base hummed with the constant, mechanical breath of logistics. Inside, his cabin smelt faintly of cigar smoke and paper and the iron tang of duty. He let the light fall on the map, tracing with his eyes the red lines Patton had drawn as if they were scars. Each arrow was a brazen promise, each label a dare. When Mara came to the doorway, he did not look up. He knew the sound of her footsteps now, deliberate, quiet, as someone who had learned how to hide everything she carried. "Admiral," she said, and the title slipped from her lips like an offering. She closed the cabin door behind her with a soft click, and for a moment the world outside contracted into the two of them and the map and the unspoken difficulties between them. "You shouldn't be here," Halsey said without turning. His voice was tired but not unkind. There was an unasked permission in it, as if the room were a kind of confessional. "I shouldn't," she agreed. She crossed to the desk and placed a folded sheet of paper between them, the edges edged in the neatness of intelligence work. Halsey unfolded it with the cautious reverence of a man handling something fragile. The intercepts were spliced, terse segments of transmission that, taken alone, could be written off as superstition. Strung together, they hummed like a chord strum until it sang. There were names, minor ministers, dispatchers, phrases that suggested the scope of fatigue. Willing to bargain, condition on continuity, avoid wholesale destruction. There were also the ghost phrases Mara had not spoken earlier. Emperor's presence, preserve face, urban pacification. "You risk your career with this," Halsey said. He looked at her then, really looked. The shadows under her eyes, the thin line at her lip where she chewed when thinking. "If this is wrong, it would ruin me," she finished. "If it's right and we ignore it, it will ruin millions." It was not a question of evidence. Mara's fragments were not proof in the way a trial wanted proof. They were, instead, a possibility with teeth. Halsey felt the way a commander sometimes feels before a storm. The air tight with electricity, the tiny hairs on his forearms sensitive to currents other men could not sense. He was a sailor with no map for this kind of sea. "You trust me with it?" she asked. Her voice was small, but the request contained everything. A plea for political cover, for someone with authority and the patience to parse the truth. Not to decide for me, to decide with me. Halsey folded the paper back into its original careful crease and slid it into his jacket. "We do this carefully," he said. "We cross-check with the embassy. We find intermediaries. We do not seal off channels with a sudden invasion that would silence every voice willing to speak." His words were decisions turned into strategy, but there was something else threaded through them, a promise made with more than duty. "You will stay close to me." Mara blinked. Yes. They spoke for hours, and for every moment of tactical parsing, there were quieter moments that cost Halsey something he could not name. She talked about Honolulu in pieces, how her mother braided hair with the old songs, and how, in quieter times, the family had kept Japanese paper cranes in a box as talismans. She described translating a fragment of a dispatch she could still taste as burnt tea, an idiom that, in translation, hinted at the exhaustion of command. The image felt intimate as a photograph passed across a table. When she rose to leave, Halsey surprised himself by offering his arm. He did not need to. He had been a man who had never been given to theatrics. But Mara took it as if there was nothing unusual in the gesture, and her hand in the crook of his elbow was an astonishment, warm, small, and unbelievably human. He thought, absurdly, that he could feel the map in her bones, the delicate balance of courage and fear. Word reached them the next morning that Patton had petitioned Nimitz directly, bypassing the cautious channels Halsey believed government demanded. He had the charisma of a man who assumed the world would defer to his certainty, and he wrote with the kind of prose that relied on exclamation rather than clause. His petition was courted, his mouthpieces aggressive. He had friends who believed him. The simple arithmetic of decisiveness seduced men worn porous by years of waiting. Halsey read the petition as one reads a confession, open, loud, the kind that had the power to rally or to ruin. Patton, meanwhile, did not hide his contempt for the slow machinery of negotiation. He ramped up pressure in public ceremonies, in speeches that were sugar and salt for the troops' ears. He sent delegations to training grounds near the beaches, made sure the cameras had men in uniform moving in rehearsed violence. Where Halsey walked like someone trying not to disturb holy ground, Patton moved like a man who wanted to remake the ground entirely. The emotional friction between them began to contextually translate into private jeopardy. When they passed one another in corridors, they were not simply colleagues who disagreed. They were magnetic bodies with opposing charges that drew them together with an intensity that made Halsey feel dizzy. Patton's eyes lingered at the angle of Halsey's jaw. Halsey found himself cataloging the way Patton's hands flexed, the small scar near his knuckle. On an evening when rain drove itself like thrown pebbles against the plexiglass of the officers' club, Patton cornered Halsey near the bar. The lights low, the room filled with men who drank like they were trying to drown memory. "Admiral," Patton said, voice smooth, "we can do this one of two ways. You can fight me in public and risk paralysis, or you can give me a chance and let me prove the sea can love speed as much as land loves the roar of engines." Halsey looked at him and found the man was no longer a map and a cigar. He was suddenly very alive, very present in the edges of Halsey's vision. There was hunger in him, the same hunger that had filled battlefields with men, now turned toward Halsey like a tide. Halsey felt a heat rise in his neck, an unexpected, dangerous warmth of being seen in a way he had not permitted for years. "You are not asking for permission," Halsey said, "not wanting to speak the tauter truths. You are demanding it." Patton smiled, a dangerous tilt. "There's a difference." In the weeks that followed, moments of alliance were interrupted by explosive rows and then sudden, baffling tenderness. Patton could be maddeningly malevolent, refusing to see anything that did not fit his arithmetic. Yet at other times, he was unexpectedly exposed. A flash of loneliness when he read casualty lists, a raw edge when he spoke of sons he had never had but believed he could father through victory. Halsey found, to his quiet alarm, that these were the moments that unmoored him. He had lived his life as a man at the center of storms, and someone had offered him sunlight and salt at the same time, dangerous elements that accepted no gentle handling. Mara watched them with an unreadable face. She had willingly placed herself in the center of the argument, and as the weeks progressed, the weight of her secret compressed her into small motions, a hand over a mouth when she unspooled a failed attempt to open a channel, eyes that watched Halsey with a gratitude that bordered on worship. Halsey, in turn, found himself protective of her in a way that made him bristle. She was, he told himself, a soldier and an asset, but she was also the one who had trusted him with the thread that might save thousands. That trust was a fragile thing he felt in his bones. The first real fracture came not in the war room, but in a makeshift medical tent where a small courier, listless with fever, had been laid out on a cot. The world had a way of reducing priorities when there was a human face in crisis. Halsey lingered, hands at his back, watching as medics fussed. Patton stormed in, a tempest of impatience, dragging officers behind him, his attention snagged first on the casualty and then on Halsey like a magnet finding metal. "You're wasting time," Patton said, "not on the patient, but on the situation. We delay, we die." Halsey's fingers clenched. In the noises the medics made, there was nothing but the raw machinery of saving. He was not an abstract general in that moment. He was a man who had pulled sailors from wreckage and held their faces in his hands while they coughed salt water into palm. The ledger was not an account number, but a person on a cot with a fever. "Not everything is decided by the speed of a march, General," Halsey said quietly. "Some things are decided by the mercy a man is willing to grant a life." Patton's face flickered between exasperation and something that resembled pity. Mercy is useless on a map. "Mercy keeps men alive," Halsey shot back, "and that matters." Patton stepped closer, and Halsey could smell the tobacco, the metal of a life always on alert. "You love your men too much," Patton said. "It makes you weak." "It makes me responsible," Halsey replied. The word landed heavier than either of them expected. That night, Halsey dreamed of a beach under a white sky. Men ran in distant patterns, the sea flat and inscrutable. He could feel the ledger heavy beneath his ribs, the pages brittle with salt. He woke with the taste of metal in his mouth and the low, desperate ache of someone who had been given a decision and refused to make it. Patton was waiting at dawn, as if storms could not be kept at bay by sleep. Then an impossible thing happened. Halsey found himself seeking Patton at the briefing the next day. Not for strategy, not for the map, but for the conversation he could not have out loud. Patton was alone, leaning against a wall, the light falling across his jaw in a way that softened his angles. For a long moment, both men were two strangers who had been cast together into the same tempest. "What do you want from me?" Halsey asked. The question was beyond politics. It was intimate and dangerous. Patton shrugged, hands in his pockets. "To be trusted to finish what needs finishing," he said. "To stop watching the ocean like a man who expects it to swallow him." Halsey thought of ghosts, of sailors whose names he kept like rosary beads. He thought of Mara's paper cranes, of messages half-translated, of the thin cord that might be a lifeline. He thought of Patton's hunger and how it mirrored his own in ways that frightened him. Both men using different instruments to conquer the same void. And he felt something else, an ache that was not his duty but his heart, a hollow that Patton's presence filled with equal measures of terror and solace. "You are dangerous," Halsey said. It was not an accusation, it was recognition. "And you are indecisive," Patton returned. Dangerous in another way. Their faces were close enough that Halsey could see the pulse at Patton's temple. The tilt of his mouth softened, not into civility, but into something like yearning. For a strangled second they hovered, two men who had never been permitted softness, tempted by a connection that could not be reduced to policy or strategy. Halsey felt the world narrow to the angle of that moment, the imminence of the map, the hum of engines, the low private question of whether a man trained to command could allow himself to be commanded by feeling. Before either could yield, Mara appeared at the doorway, and the moment splintered. She carried news. An attempted contact had failed. A voice on the line had chosen silence over speech. Her face was the room after a storm, raw and honest and small. "We are running out of time," she said, and the two men turned back to the world of duty as if someone had rung a bell. The fragile intimacy evaporated like salt in the sun, leaving behind a fresh, keen wound of desire and regret. They resumed their stances, Halsey the reluctant guardian, Patton the fierce proponent of conquest. Their attraction remained, a tension that made every professional touch electric. Each argument, each small truce, built a ladder between them that neither wanted to climb, but both found themselves drawn toward. Mara stood between them like a compass, holding secrets that could tip the balance. The war continued, and the war within them accelerated, a painful, intoxicating current that promised salvation or ruin in equal measure. As Act 2 closed, the stakes were clarified. An invasion demanded by impatient men, a possible surrender hidden in fragments, two powerful commanders drawn into a gravitational pull neither could publicly admit, and a woman whose courage had given them the choice they wanted and the truth they feared. The ocean waited beyond the base, indifferent, patient as a judge. Inside, three lives had braided together in a way none of them could yet unpick. The next decision would not be tactical alone. It would force them to confront what they loved, what they feared, and whether they would become the men who chose to save lives or the men who burned them to secure a victory that might mean nothing at all. The first fracture sounded like a telephone ringing in the dark, urgent, impossible to ignore. A courier arrived at dawn with a packet stamped emergency.
Mara opened it with knuckles gone pale and hands that trembled, because everyone understood what an emergency meant in that season. Someone else had decided the hour could not wait for slow courage. Inside were fresh intercepts, clearer than the ragged fragments she had given Halsey.
Names that had been whispers now had faces. A mid-level bureaucrat in Kyoto who had begun to plead for channels. A regional commander who wrote of his troops' exhaustion and the impossibility of continued urban combat. A foreign minister's aide who had suggested an intermediary from a neutral nation might be tolerated. There was a calendar of meetings, a pattern of small public denials that, under the code, read like the nervous coughs of someone covering a truth. Mara's mouth went dry. She folded the papers into the palm of her hand as if holding something alive. She thought of Honolulu and paper cranes, of the way her mother had mended torn cloth with stitches so small they were invisible. These names, and the map of fatigue, was a kind of mend she had been entrusted to offer. But men took mends in different ways. Some accepted them with gratitude. Some ripped them open to see how they worked. Some never permitted anything other than the bluntest repairs. She went to Halsey first because the thing she had promised was not only to present evidence, but to seek a way that might turn it into life savings rather than bodies counted. Halsey read the new intercepts in the cabin until the paper blurred at the edges. He walked the length of the room like a man paced by an invisible knot, the map's red pencil swallowed and then found again in his mind. For the first time since the argument in the war room, his face betrayed more than professional caution. It betrayed the raw edge of someone who feared making a humane mistake as much as he feared a foolish one. "We can open a channel," he said at last. "Discreet, small delegations, a neutral intermediary." His voice was careful brilliance, engineered to soften the gambit into procedure. "We give them a face-saving way to back down. We hold the accord publicly, then move the transports away from prime towns to avoid massacre." Mara watched him and felt an all-encompassing relief like the first warm wind after a month of frost. Then the door crashed open and Patton filled the cabin like a storm, cigar already forgotten between his fingers. "What are you doing?" he demanded, eyes on the papers in Halsey's palm as if they were a betrayal. Halsey's jaw set. "We are exploring options." Patton laughed, a sound without mirth. "You mean you're conspiring to hand me a war halfway done? These channels mean nothing. They are a curtain while the enemy readies to stab us." He stepped toward the desk, and the motion was a challenge. "If you begin dancing with diplomats while I have men dying every day waiting to go ashore, I will not forgive you." Mara's relief thinned to a thread. "You are not hearing them," she said. "You are not hearing what they want." "And what do they want, Miss Iwasaki?" Patton spat the name like he tested it for salt. "To be left in their palaces while we do the fighting? To keep their honor while their cities are hollowed? I will not be made the instrument of the enemy's trick." Halsey leaned forward, palm on the table, eyes bright with a sudden and awful clarity. "Do you want men to die to prove you right?" Patton's face lost its color for the barest second. There was an edge there Halsey had not seen before, as if the question carved into something vital. "Sometimes sacrifices are necessary," he said, and the phrase held in it the sentence of his life, a belief that victory sanctified cost. Mara could not hold. The papers slid from her fingers like rain. "They are not asking for abandonment," she said. "They ask for a mechanism that would spare civilians and, potentially, allow for an emperor's dignity." "A monarch's dignity," Patton interrupted. "We are not here to flatter an institution while our boys get shot." Halsey looked at Patton as if he had been struck. "You reduce everything to bodies," he said. "There are lives beyond the uniform." Patton's laughter this time was a knife. "You talk about lives like someone counting candles in a chapel." He touched Halsey's face with the back of his hand as if measuring the Admiral's resolve. "You are not a man of action, Halsey. You are a man of memory." That insult stung something inside Halsey that had nothing to do with leadership. Memory saved him and damned him. He had worshipped memory as a ledger because it was proof of that which deserved guarding. To be accused of being only memory was to be told he had no spine. He reached for something, for an argument that might heal, and found only the hollow. "You call me weak," Halsey said, voice low. "You call me indecisive, but I have seen what haste does. I have seen it is not theory to me, it is ledger." "You hide behind ledger while men march to guns," Patton shot back. "You are not willing to accept the calculus of command." Mara found she could not bear it. She slammed her palm onto the desk. "This is not about calculus. It's about channels of surrender. It's about whether you are capable of letting go of your need to be the man who finishes everything with blood." Patton's face changed in a flicker. Anger, yes, but also something raw. For a moment, his hand did not quiver. Then it did. "You do not know me," he said, too soft for the room. "Then tell us," Halsey said. "If you have something to say that will make us see the world through your eyes, say it. But do not fling men's lives into the ocean to prove that you are right." Patton looked at them both, two men who had entered him like weather. And suddenly the facade collapsed. He stepped back with a noise that could have been a laugh or a sob, and turned his face away. The room brimmed with a silence that felt like the flat eye of the storm. "I do not want to fail," he said finally, too low for the cigar-littered men in corridors to hear. "You think I crave blood. I crave certainty. When a man of my history measures himself by what he does, the alternative is the worst kind of nothing. Failure means I am less than the whole of what I imagine myself to be. I will not bear it." The confession landed like a grenade. Halsey felt a sudden and terrible sympathy. He understood, horribly, the map of a man who measured himself by the weight he could bear and the width of the ground he could take. But sympathy did not dissolve policy. It complicated it. It set two jagged human edges to touch and bleed. Mara stepped back, eyes so wide they shone. "That is not a reason to throw away lives," she whispered. "That is a reason to be afraid." Patton laughed again, a short sound that was nearly a sob. "You both pity me," he said. "You either manipulate me with compassion, or you cower from me with policies." "You ask us to cower?" Halsey snapped, because this was more than strategy now. It was the taste of betrayal. You have petitioned up the chain, publicly undermining the diplomacy we might need. You have rallied public opinion to your demand. You have made it harder for us to try a cautious path. Patton's jaw twitched. "What do you want, Admiral? To be loved for not risking, or to be feared for being timid?" "What I want," Halsey said slowly, "is for men to live." Patton, in a movement that was part fury and part grief, slammed his fist down on the desk so hard the map buckled. Paper flew. The three of them flinched as if struck. The sound echoed. It was a physical punctuation to the collapse that had been building between them. "You will not give me command," Patton said. "You will attempt your delicate diplomacy, which may or may not work. And meanwhile, men will die because you could not be decisive. And yet," he looked at Halsey then with a complexity that fractured the anger into something else, "and yet, you will be the one to shoulder it when it fails." "You assume I will fail?" Halsey answered. "You assume the only language of strength is speed." "For you, perhaps," Patton said.
For me, the only acceptable end is to be the man who closes the gap. Mara's hands were suddenly clumsy. She gathered the strewn papers like someone scooping up the remains of a life. "You both make assumptions about the other," she said. "You both have histories you're too proud to call weaknesses." "So what?" Patton said. "We are soldiers. We do the necessary." "Sometimes what is necessary is to be human," Halsey replied. "Sometimes it is to listen." Patton's face softened in an expression that looked dangerously like longing. For a breath, both their decades of brute competence and subtle damage hung exposed. Halsey felt something like love, a terrorizing, electric thing, pool in his chest for Patton, so quick and forbidding that his ribs ached. He saw the rawness beneath the general's composure, a man hollowed by the need to be whole through conquest. It was the kind of knowledge that either made a man tender or destroyed him. Halsey did not know which path he would choose. "You will not stop me if I petition again," Patton said quietly. "I will not be stopped." "You will not be alone when you do it," Halsey answered before he could stop himself. The concession startled them all. It was not support, it was a brittle, painful promise. "If you insist on momentum, you do it with us nearby. You will not be free to order blind charges. You will have our oversight. We will temper you." Patton's mouth folded like a sail in a sudden gust. "You're offering chains." "Better than ghosts," Halsey said. They were not reconciled. The promise was a turmoil, conditional, watchful, full of the threat of new betrayals. It fractured something in Patton, his absolute certainty, and it broke something in Halsey, the purity of restraint. For Mara, the bargain was both salvation and ruin, an avenue to preserve life, but one that meant binding herself to a man who might yet unleash a storm. Weeks later, word arrived that one of the intermediaries Mara had cautiously approached had been captured by a faction within Japan opposed to negotiation. Photographs surfaced, grainy, deliberate, of a neutral envoy blindfolded. The message was clear. Anyone who tried to bend the war toward mercy would be punished. The front page of newspapers back home flashed it like an accusation. Patton used it as proof that diplomacy was naive. Halsey read it as a warning about the terrain of hearts and politics. Mara stopped sleeping. She began to move like someone who had already swallowed the consequences of a choice and could not find an answer. Patton's petitions grew louder. Halsey tightened the oversight he had promised, and with each tightened measure there was a fresh pain. A man used to commanding, now learning to control himself with other men watching. The relationships between them crumbled into shards that sometimes fit together and sometimes did not. There were nights when they slept in the same facility and the shared proximity hummed with electricity. There were mornings when a single headline could sever them into strangers. Trust, which had threatened to become intimacy, descended into bargaining. Each concession felt like a fracture. Each felt like salvation. On a rain-dark afternoon, Halsey found Mara alone in the intelligence office. She was rocking in a chair like someone trying to slow a tremor. He sat without speaking, and for a long time neither of them moved. When he finally reached for her hand, she flinched like a child caught in a lie. Her eyes were red, not from sleep, but from the danger of what she carried. "We cannot know who will be brave enough to open their mouths," she whispered, "and we cannot know who will be cruel enough to silence them." "I did not think courage could look like this." Halsey pressed his thumb to her knuckles. The gesture was small and ordinary and enormous. "You were brave," he said. "If this is revealed, you will be the one who kept men alive. If it fails, we will be the men who bear the consequences." She laughed, bitter and tiny.
"And what of you, Admiral? Will you rest inside your ledger or burn it alive to save them?" Halsey closed his eyes. The ledger had a smell now, a salt-stiff thing that had been his comfort and his curse. "I will not let them die to make me whole," he said. Mara's look hardened into a razor of decision. "Then we must act now," she said. "Not slowly enough for Patton's taste, not so quickly as to be foolish. We will attempt one final channel. We will be careful, we will be brave." "And you will keep me honest," Halsey said. "And you will keep me alive," Mara replied. Outside, rain flattened into the ocean, and the base hummed like a beast waiting to be led. Inside, 3 lives had shifted into new positions. No longer simply allies, no longer merely rivals, but something more fractured, and therefore more truthful. Secrets lay like landmines beneath the corridors of their relationships. Fractures opened in the faces they kept for public hours. Hearts, like maps, were redrawn. Their next moves would not be military only. They would be personal, explosive, and irreversible. One intercepted message would become a test of judgment. One public speech would rip open private seams. And in the quiet between orders, Halsey began to understand that the ledger could be rewritten, but only if he and the other men could finally stop measuring worth by conquest and start measuring it by mercy. The cost, he realized with a leaden certainty, would be everything they were unwilling to show anyone else. They moved like conspirators in the hours after Mara's decision. Quiet, precise, each step an agreement that whatever they were to become would be paid for in secrecy and risk. Halsey wrote the orders with hands that trembled not from age, but from feeling. Contingencies, safe words, an oversight committee he would sit on personally. Patton read them and tore a strip of paper with his teeth the way a man strips bark, impatience rolling off him in little waves. Yet he signed where a man signs when he has decided to put his neck on the line for something he has begun to see as larger than his own hunger. They made the channel small. Mara found a neutral intermediary whose name did not spark headlines, a diplomat of the kind who moved like smoke through rooms and left no fingerprints. Halsey gave the man safe passage, Patton provided the feint. The plan was dangerous in equal measure. A public show of force to satisfy the hawks and reassure the troops, paired with a clandestine opening that communicated, in the dead code of diplomacy, that there would be no annihilation of civilian centers if the emperor's presence could be preserved and a continuity of governance assured. Mercy braided with muscle. On the morning the envoy should have arrived, the base thrummed with an anxious electricity. Every radio crackled, every uniform felt warmer. Patton paced as if he could march the bolt of fate into place with his boots. Halsey had never seen a man who could make impatience seem like prayer. When the intermediary's motorcade approached, Mara's hands shook so hard she could barely present the folded message they had rehearsed like a liturgy. But a third party had been watching them, a hardline faction that believed any negotiation was a betrayal. The envoy's car was ambushed on the mountain road outside the city. A human billboard posted with a warning that mercy would earn you death. Photographs of the wreck were meant to humiliate. A gloved hand had planted evidence that the envoy had been a spy. The message was simple and brutal. Negotiations would be made impossible by violence. Patton's face went a color that had nothing to do with his uniforms. For the first time, the general who thrived on momentum had to choose the shape of his own violence. He could scream for the invasion then and there. He could use this crude murder as proof that talks were a trap. He could, in short, become the man he feared he might be. Instead, he did something more dangerous. He put his cigar out with his own shoe and called on the radios. He ordered a cover operation,
an aggressive public show of naval bombardment and landing rehearsals designed to convince the hardliners their leverage had narrowed. But he also ordered a covert retrieval mission, one so dangerous that he would have to lead it himself. The mission was not to land on Tokyo's beaches. It was to secure the mountain road and retrieve survivors, to show that they would not be cowed into bloodshed when life could be saved by the kind of decisive tenderness Halsey had argued for. Halsey felt membranes inside him tear and knit all at once. Patton's maneuver was both a demonstration and a sacrifice, a calculated risk that would burn political capital and perhaps lives, but also a chance to redeem the envoy's life or at least recover their dignity. Patton volunteered to command the retrieval personally. It meant he would be within range of sniper fire, ambush, the raw edges of the war he loved and hated. It meant he would also be visible, publicly vulnerable, if the operation failed. "You will not go alone," Halsey said. The words came out of him as both order and plea. He could not keep from it. The fear in his chest was personal now, the beat of a heart no ledger could account for. Patton looked at him, and in that look were all the violent, brittle hopes he kept like bad weather. "If it gets someone back," he said, "I will do it." They moved at dusk. Mara stayed at command, hands on the radio like a conductor. Halsey rode with the retrieval unit, because he could not bear to be anywhere but near Patton. And when the convoy rounded the last bend and the wreck sat like a thing sacrificed to fury, the world contracted into the small, dangerous act of pulling bodies from wreckage and sorting truth from propaganda. Gunfire cut the air. The retrieval was messy and close, the kind of action that makes the tactical map irrelevant, because the world is suddenly an animal and not a diagram. Patton walked into it like muscle and apology. He was shot, an ugly ripping sound, and then the narrow focus of pain. Halsey saw him fall and felt the ocean in his ribs, a tidal, overwhelming surge that made him half mad. "Hold on," Halsey commanded, the voice of an admiral and nothing else. He crawled into the no-man's land between shell and salvation, reached Patton and cradled him like a man holding a confession. Blood quickened on uniform, and Patton's face, the face Halsey had cataloged in a dozen private ways, half-lidded with pain and something softer. Relief? Recognition? That loosened Halsey's sternest defenses. "You are a fool," Halsey said, not able to be otherwise, tears salt and sudden on his cheek. The world narrowed to the smallness of Patton's palm clenched against Halsey's sleeve. "You are a coward," Patton replied, voice shallow and immediate as a child's, "and you are brave enough to prove it." Mara's silhouette appeared through the smoke, face set like a blade. She had directed the extraction, hacked channels to bring ambulances and diplomats, to confuse the narrative that the hardliners tried to build. She grabbed Halsey's hand and never let go. "We have eyes on neutral witnesses," she said, voice steady. "We'll spin this as an atrocity against an envoy. It will not be clean, but it will be enough to hold open a sliver." Patton's breathing stuttered. Halsey's fingers dug into his shoulder, as if anchoring him to the earth and to the single truth that mattered. This was the moment you loved someone you did not have the right to. Halsey had spent a life keeping distance like a hedge. He could not now pretend. He bent and pressed his mouth to Patton's forehead, not a kiss for passion, but a sealing. It was a gesture that belonged to men who had been softened by sorrow and tempered by consequence. "You promise me," Patton whispered, the words thin as maps, "that if I go too far, you will stop me." Halsey's thumb slid over Patton's wrist, a small oath. "I will stop you," he said, "and if I fail, I will carry it." Patton's hand flexed in a faint, absurd mimicry of a salute. "Then carry me too, when I cannot stand." The field hospital became a theater where mercy and duty stared at each other until one blinked. Patton's wound was not fatal, but it was reckoning. A body that would carry scar as proof of something other than triumph.
Proof, instead, that he had chosen to spare himself the easiest sin. The photograph of the ambush went international with the spin Mara and Halsey arranged. Hardliners had attacked an envoy. The Allied reaction had been constrained but resolute. Negotiations could yet be pursued. It was the smallest of victories, but in war, small things save lives. In the slow hours after, Halsey slept in the cot beside Patton's bed while the general convalesced. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and iron and something Halsey had not known he had wanted: the steady, even breathing of a man whose life had been laid in his hands. When Patton woke and the first thing his eyes found was Halsey, the Admiral's chest made a sound like a release. "You could have left," Patton muttered. "I could not," Halsey replied simply. Patton tried to grin, the motion crooked with pain. "Then you love me," he said, as if it were a diagnosis. Halsey's answer was not immediate. It had to gather like weather. "I do not know the word," he said finally, "but I know I will not forgive myself if I let you throw away men to keep from being a man you are terrified to be without conquest." Patton's laugh was a small, broken thing. "That counts." Mara arrived then, weary but triumphant in the way of those who had navigated violence with words. She set a steaming cup in Halsey's hand, and when she saw the way the two men looked at one another, let the space between them breathe. "I convinced Kyoto to let an intermediary survive on paper," she said. "They will talk. I cannot promise peace, only that the window is open." Halsey looked at Patton and then at Mara, and something that had been like iron inside him softened. The ledger did not vanish. It reshaped. It now held new entries: a recovery, a returned envoy, a life spared. It also held Halsey's admission, the small, mortal risk he had taken to hold to a different kind of victory. When Patton reached for Halsey's hand, it was an offer and an apology, an arrangement of scars and longing that neither could deny. Halsey took it. Their fingers threaded like ropes, binding two dangerous men who had learned to disarm themselves in order to protect more than pride. Mara stood by them, the secret keeper who had given them the chance to choose mercy, and for a moment the three of them looked like a strange, fragile family. Romance in the middle of war was not a neat thing. It came with compromises and uncertain endings. But that night, the mapping of their futures shifted. Patton had bared his fear and paid a price for the dignity he thought he needed. Halsey had answered with courage that felt, to him, dangerously like love. Mara had threaded a needle through diplomacy and risk and given them a seam to hold. Outside, the ocean kept its indifferent counsel, but in the little, battered hospital, the world felt momentarily reassembled. They had risked and they had saved, and in the aftermath, the three of them, wounded, vigilant, improbably entangled, learned that redemption sometimes demanded the very thing they feared most: the surrender of the self to someone else's steadiness. The cost had been dear. The reward was more than victory. It was the possibility of survival, of a future in which men learned that power could be tempered by mercy, and that love, when confessed in the narrow hours between explosions, could be the strategic choice that saved more than lives. They did not march into triumph with fanfare. They negotiated victory the way long marriages are mended, awkwardly, insistently, with the slow trade of pride for preservation. The envoy's survival, spun, protected, amplified by Mara's deft leaks, kept a corridor open. Tokyo's councils whispered, then argued, then leaned. Hardliners lost leverage to proof that mercy could be performed without weakness. Patton's name remained in dispatches, but now beside it were phrases he had never wanted: restraint, oversight, accountability. He bore his scar like an ugly medal and learned to let Halsey read his face without armor.
Mara was reassigned to a quieter post in Tokyo as liaison, credited quietly and publicly, her family's cranes folded into a box she kept by the porthole. She became the seam between worlds, translator of fear into possibility. Halsey returned to sea with a ledger still heavy but rewritten in small, livable lines. Saved towns, spared children, fewer corpses to count. Patton resumed command but with a new cadence. He still wanted to finish what needed finishing, but he now listened before he shouted. They met sometimes in the long, thin hours when the base felt most human. An evening of shared coffee, a hand held under a sheet, Mara's laugh like paper against the sea. Love did not arrive as proclamation, but as habit. The habit of showing up, of answering the radio, of staying when it would have been easier to leave. When at last they parted to their separate duties, Halsey watched Patton walk the deck and thought of tides, how they erode cliffs and also reveal shells. He kept Mara's cranes on his desk, a small folded proof that mercy could be engineered and that hearts could be chartered like ships. On the day the surrender became official, a quiet dawn ribboned the harbor. Halsey stood at the rail, Patton beside him, fingers almost touching. Behind them, Mara watched from the quay, hand to her mouth, eyes bright as the sea.
A gull cut across the light, and their shadows drifted together on the water. Three shapes, weathered and leaning toward one another. And for a single profound moment, the ocean returned their reflection. Not the ledger of loss, but the map of what they had chosen to save.